Focused on trade and security.
The United States respects the sovereignty of the British people and their right of self-determination. A free and independent Britain is a blessing to the world, and our relationship has never been stronger. Both America and Britain understand that governments must be responsive to everyday working people, that governments must represent their own citizens. Madam Prime Minister, we look forward to working closely with you as we strengthen our mutual ties in commerce, business, and foreign affairs. Great days lie ahead for our two peoples and our two countries.
Plenty more from the news conference shortly, but first our correspondent Barbara Plett-Usher is at the White House for us. So Barbara, Theresa May came here really needing a trade deal, but she also got a very strong commitment, didn't she, from Donald Trump over NATO. Tell us more about that.
Yes, Laura, I think there are a number of things that were important for her in this press conference. One of them was this commitment she said she got, and then she spoke to Mr. Trump and she said, you said you were 100% behind NATO, didn't you? To which she replied in the affirmative. That's a very important signal to send not only to Britain but to members of the European Union. So that's an achievement for her. She did say that they had also talked about ways to reform NATO and make it more nimble with dealing with current threats like cybersecurity and terrorism. These are things that Mr. Trump has talked about before. I think the other thing that was important for her to get, which she did, was his statement on torture, which is something that has played very badly over in the UK. He was asked about his support for torture or his belief that it could work, and he said, yes, that is my belief, but I'm going to defer to my Secretary of Defense, General James Mattis, and he does not believe that torture is the way to go, and he will have the deciding vote on this. So that was also quite a clear statement, I thought, on an issue that has been quite contentious in the UK and here in many quarters as well.
And Barbara, the two leaders are having a working lunch now in the White House. Theresa May said that they were going to talk about Syria and Russia. What's likely to come up there, do you think?
Well, it was interesting that Russia was raised in the news conference as well with regards to Mr. Trump's ties to Mr. Putin, which he downplayed. He said, I've not met the man. I don't know whether we'll have a good relationship or not. Half the time, I think I'm going to have a really great relationship with somebody, and then I don't. So we'll see. So he left that open. Also, probably more importantly for Britain, this issue of sanctions. There have been reports that he might be considering lifting sanctions, and he essentially said that's very premature. It's too early to say about that, which is something that will have reassured Mrs. May, because she repeated Britain's position that sanctions on Russia should not be lifted until the Minsk agreement is implemented on Ukraine. In terms of Russia and Syria, Mr. Trump has talked very much about being willing to join Russia in fighting Islamic State in Syria, putting the fate of Bashar al-Assad, the strong ally of Russia, on the back burner. And it is possible that Mrs. May will be willing to go some distance with him on that, based on comments made by her Foreign Secretary quite recently.
Barbara Plett-Usher at the White House, thank you very much indeed. Now, the first British journalist to ask a question was our own political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. Here's what happened.
Laura?
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News. Prime Minister, you've talked about where you agree, but you have also said you would be frank where you disagree with the President. Can you tell us where in our talks you did disagree? And do you think that the President listened to what you had to say? And, Mr. President, you say... We'll see what she says. Mr. President, you've said before that torture works. You've praised Russia. You've said you want to ban some Muslims from coming to America. You've suggested there should be punishment for abortion. For many people in Britain, those sound like alarming beliefs. What do you say to our viewers at home who are worried about some of your views and worried about you becoming the leader of the free world?
This was your choice of a question. There goes that relationship.
On the issue issue that you raised with me, Laura. Can I confirm that I've been listening to the President and the President has been listening to me? That's the point of having a conversation and a dialogue. And we have been discussing a number of topics. We'll carry on after this press conference meeting and discussing a number of other topics. And there will be times when we disagree and issues on which we disagree. The point of the special relationship is that we are able to have that open and frank discussion so that we are able to make that clear when it happens. But I'm clear also that there are many issues on which the United Kingdom and the United States stand alongside one another, many issues on which we agree. And I think, as I said yesterday in my speech, that we are at a moment now when we can build an even stronger special relationship, which will be in the interests not just of the UK and the United States, but actually in the interests of the wider world as well.
Very good. We have a great general who has just been appointed Secretary of Defense, General James Mattis, and he has stated publicly that he does not necessarily believe in torture or waterboarding, or however you want to define it. Enhanced interrogation, I guess, would be a word that a lot of people would like to use. I don't necessarily agree, but I would tell you that he will override because I'm giving him that power. He's an expert. He's highly respected. He's the general's general. Got through the Senate very, very quickly, which in this country is not easy, I will tell you. And so I'm going to rely on him. I happen to feel that it does work. I've been open about that for a long period of time. But I am going with our leaders. And we're going to win with or without. But I do disagree. As far as, again, Putin and Russia, I don't say good, bad, or indifferent. I don't know the gentleman. I hope we have a fantastic relationship. That's possible, and it's also possible that we won't. We will see what happens. I will be representing the American people very, very strongly, very forcefully. And if we have a great relationship with Russia and other countries, and if we go after ISIS together, which has to be stopped, that's an evil that has to be stopped, I will consider that a good thing, not a bad thing. How the relationship works out, I won't be able to tell you that later. I've had many times where I thought I'd get along with people, and I don't like them at all. And I've had some where I didn't think I was going to have much of a relationship, and it turned out to be a great relationship. So, Teresa, we never know about those things, do we? But I will tell you one thing, I'll be representing the American people very strongly.
Well, we can now get a reaction to that joint news conference between President Trump and Prime Minister Theresa May from our political correspondent, Chris Mason, who's in London. So, Chris, Theresa May really had to walk a tightrope here, didn't she? Making sure she gets that trade deal because Britain is going to leave the EU, but not wanting to defer too much to Donald Trump. How did she do?
It was extraordinary to watch it, wasn't it? Because it's one of those moments where, as a political correspondent, you have to be, yes, partially the political correspondent, but also the body language expert and pop psychologist as well, as you see the dynamic between the two leaders, both new in post. Mrs. May, the first foreign leader to step into the White House since President Trump took office. And so you could see an element of the awkwardness there, as well as the fact that they'd not met before. I was really struck early on how the Prime Minister was willing explicitly to say that the President in their private talks had given 100% backing to NATO, because we've seen the scepticism that President Trump has articulated towards NATO, using the word obsolete even to describe it, and particularly concerned about what he sees as the unfair funding burden that Washington has to shoulder for the Atlantic Alliance. We've heard lots of concern here in the UK, not just from the governing Conservatives, but across the House of Commons in the last few days about that outlook from President Trump on NATO. It was one of the questions, if you like, tucked into the Prime Minister's pocket, Prime Minister's questions just the other day. And for her to explicitly say that they'd had that conversation in private and she had had, as she would see it, reassuring words from the President on NATO, I thought was very, very striking. As you say, she had to strike a very tricky balancing act. She has to be able to make the case that it is in the UK's interest to have a good relationship with the White House, whoever the occupier of the building happens to be. At the same time, politically and personally, they are clearly very, very different characters.
They are indeed. And what impression do you think President Trump made over there in Britain on what was, after all, his very first press conference from the White House with a foreign leader?
Again, I thought what was striking in that sense was that you got an element, I thought, from a British viewer's perspective, of President Trump as opposed to candidate Trump. He was that bit more softly spoken, wasn't he? But then you got flashes of the man that we saw on the campaign trail, and crucially, the approach that he has struck that is so different to how so many other occupiers of senior political roles tend to operate. Just at the end of that exchange you were playing a couple of minutes ago, when he was talking about volunteering, the difference of view between him and his Defence Secretary over waterboarding and torture, and volunteering that his Defence Secretary, as a subordinate obviously to the President, would have, he said, the final say over the policy. That kind of approach to publicly volunteering differences within government and publicly acknowledging that a subordinate might have the final say, it is to a watcher of conventional politics over the years something of a surprise. I suspect, in terms of the overall UK reaction, the die-hard critics of Mr Trump won't have changed their mind watching the press conference. Those who love him will be reassured that what they've always said, which is that a presidency for Mr Trump would be good news for the UK, was proven in that news conference. And maybe some who are open-minded and willing to be persuaded one way or the other might acknowledge that there is another side to President Trump than some of those tub-thumping performances we saw when he was on the campaign stage.
Chris Mason in London, thank you very much indeed for that view. Now, Mr Trump is planning to speak to Vladimir Putin on the phone on Saturday. His relationship with the Russian president was brought up, and here's what he had to say in that press conference.
As far as, again, Putin and Russia, I don't say good, bad, or indifferent. I don't know the gentleman. I hope we have a fantastic relationship. That's possible, and it's also possible that we won't. We will see what happens. I will be representing the American people very, very strongly, very forcefully. And if we have a great relationship with Russia and other countries, and if we go after ISIS together, which has to be stopped, that's an evil that has to be stopped, I will consider that a good thing, not a bad thing. How the relationship works out, I won't be able to tell you that later. I've had many times where I thought I'd get along with people, and I don't like them at all. And I've had some where I didn't think I was going to have much of a relationship, and it turned out to be a great relationship. So, Teresa, we never know about those things, do we? But I will tell you one thing, I'll be representing the American people very strongly.
Donald Trump there. Now, joining me now from London is Dr. Jan Halper-Hayes, the Republican commentator and part of President Trump's transition team. Jan, thank you for joining us. So this was the president's diplomatic debut on the world stage. How did he do?
Well, I thought he did very, very well. I was very disappointed that the first question that he was asked, which took everything out of context, is going back to campaign stuff. Women being punished for abortion was a hypothetical question. He changed his position and very much came out with just yesterday that anyone coming from an Arab nation that supports terrorism, they have accomplished more things on his to-do list, and every single day there has been an achievement of one of his promises. People are in shock what he has done.
Well, Jan Halper-Hayes, can we just stick to what was said at the press conference just now, if you don't mind? What did you make of Theresa May saying that the president had told her he's 100% behind NATO, when in other comments he suggested that NATO's obsolete? Were you reassured by that commitment to NATO?
Well, I think that, again, people take Trump literally and not seriously and combine things. I am sure he still feels that it is obsolete, because actually Donald Rumsfeld said it was obsolete. He is most perturbed that we carry 80% of the costs and 27 nations do not pay for it. So if you think that's disappeared, and the fact of the matter is that he selected, who's now been confirmed, General Mattis, who is behind NATO, and his commitment is unshakable. And that is the other good thing about Donald Trump as a leader, is that he doesn't need people to agree with him. He wants the variety of opinions to make the right decisions.
He said, didn't he, Jan, in that press conference, that he will be overruled by General Mattis when it comes to torture, that he, President Trump, thinks that it works, but he accepts that General Mattis doesn't believe in it. That may seem extraordinary, but is that to you the essence of Donald Trump there?
Well, again, the essence, are we going to do literal and take pieces out, or are we going to look at the whole picture? You know, he has been very, very comfortable with people disagreeing with him, and he, in fact, created that. And he hasn't changed his opinion necessarily. What he said is that he would never ask anyone to do anything illegal. He would defer to General Mattis. In 2014, in the Wall Street Journal, an op-ed written by several intelligence people said that torture had worked. There's a part of him that believes it, but he's not going to force that belief on the people who are experts. And I think that is one of the key things about him.
Now, let's just turn to Russia, where, as we know, President Trump is going to speak tomorrow on the phone to President Vladimir Putin, someone who he said again in that press conference, if he could have a good relationship with him, that would be great. Do you think it's too early to be talking about lifting sanctions on Russia over their behaviour in Ukraine?
I don't know if it's the question of, is it too early? I think what the question is, what would be the reason? What is the thinking behind it? Is it a carrot? What is really going on? Because I'll tell you, Donald Trump does not do anything without having thought it through strategically and even anticipating what the potential reaction could be.
It was interesting, too, to me that Theresa May talked there on this question of Russia. She talked about the Minsk agreement. That's the agreement to which Russia must live up to if those sanctions imposed over Ukraine are going to be imposed. And Donald Trump, he didn't seem as familiar with the diplomatic language as Theresa May. Is that something that's going to come in time, do you think?
I think that for someone who 18 months ago, 2 years ago, was not a politician at all, has turned our entire political system upside down, who took 3,084 counties. He won those. Hillary only won 57. You know what? Give him a chance. He is a fast learner, and it has been impressive at what he has mastered in this short time.
Jan Halper-Hayes over there in London, thank you so much for that perspective on President Trump following his first meeting with a foreign leader here in Washington, D.C. Now, let's hear a little of that press conference with Theresa May. One of the key items on the agenda for Britain's Prime Minister was trade and the economy.
Trade between our two countries is already worth over £150 billion a year. The US is the single biggest source of inward investment to the UK, and together we've around $1 trillion invested in each other's economies. And the UK-US defence relationship is the broadest, deepest and most advanced of any two countries, sharing military hardware and expertise. And I think the President and I are ambitious to build on this relationship in order to grow our respective economies, provide the high-skilled, high-paid jobs of the future for working people across America and across the UK.
Theresa May there. Now, joining me is Peter Bishop, Deputy Chief Executive of the London Chambers of Commerce. So, Peter, I'm not an economist exactly, although I can run my own household. My understanding is that tariffs currently between Britain and the US are minimal. So if there was a trade deal, how much would trade really be boosted?
You're right. The WTO rules apply, and there's an extra layer on top called MFN, Most Favoured Nation. So the tariffs are not generally a barrier to trade. And as you just heard the PM say, the trade between the US and the UK is enormous. They are our biggest individual country export market, and we're in the top five at least of their export markets. Investment to is enormous too. So we're starting from a good place. When a trade agreement usually comes into play, it's because barriers to trade are high, and if you reduce those barriers, trade will grow. So there's going to be some thought put into what the trade negotiation will entail.
Well, so, Peter, wouldn't this mean if there was a trade agreement that those politically sensitive areas, which are really government protected, like defence and health spending, that Britain would have to open those up to the Americans, like open up the NHS to American health companies?
Well, they've certainly got to pick on areas where, as Donald Trump has said, he's putting Americans first. He's got to find something in it for the USA that they're getting a preferential access to us. They've got 320 million people, we've got 65 million. So it's never going to be an equal deal. It has to work for them too.
So, Peter, do you think then that this is much more about the symbolism of the special relationship between Britain and America at a time when both political leaders want to show that they can go it alone with bilateral agreements?
I think that's a very important part of it, yes. I mean, actually, by some levels of measurement, the USA and the UK are in the top 5 of the easiest places to do business in the world. So doing business with each other is, you know, at a starting point, easy. But that's not to say that free trade agreements can't achieve more. Those tariffs, although low, are not low in every sector. They can be lowered on both sides. You can take away export licensing, you can take away import licensing regimes too. You can have a mutual recognition of standards. All the non-tariff barriers things can go down. So I don't want to give the overall impression that that a free trade agreement is a bad thing, but it's not the massive boost to trade that it could be with countries where it's harder to do business.
Peter Bishop, thank you so much over there in London. Now, Donald Trump said he had a friendly call with Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto.
We had a talk that lasted for about an hour this morning, and we are going to be working on a fair relationship and a new relationship. But the United States cannot continue to lose vast amounts of business, vast amounts of companies, and millions of people losing their jobs. That won't happen with me. We're no longer going to be the country that doesn't know what it's doing. And so we are going to renegotiate our trade deals, and we're going to renegotiate other aspects of our relationship with Mexico. And in the end, I think it'll be good for both countries.
Donald Trump there talking about Mexico earlier in that press conference. And joining me now to analyse those comments on Mexico is the BBC's Rajini Vaidyanathan. So, Rajini, we just heard what Donald Trump said there in the press conference, but earlier today he had a long phone conversation with the Mexican president after that massive public bust-up yesterday, and now the Mexican president isn't coming here. What did you make of Donald Trump's public comments following the bust-up yesterday and the phone call then with the Mexican president this morning?
Well, during that news conference, Donald Trump said he's not as brash as you might think. But when you look at some of the language that he used to describe the Mexican president, he said, "I love the Mexican people, but Mexico has beaten us to a pulp." He promised to renegotiate trade deals with Mexico. And you saw a bit of the characteristic Donald Trump that we're used to, rather than the more statesman-like President Trump that we saw alongside Prime Minister May. So he's definitely continuing that fight, shall we say, although, as you said, he did have a phone conversation with Enrique Peña Nieto earlier today. I think one of the upshots from that conversation from the Mexican side we've heard is both have agreed not to discuss publicly how they will pay for the wall.
And Donald Trump didn't mention the wall, did he, just then in that presser? So maybe he's becoming steeped in the art of diplomacy already.
Well, maybe he has actually kept his part of the bargain, but as I said there, he said the US cannot continue to lose vast amounts of business to Mexico. So he's certainly not giving up some of that fight that he's picked with Mexico, which of course we saw throughout the campaign and which has led to the meeting being cancelled next week.
And what did you make of the overall tone of that press conference, Regina? You used to cover politics in Britain, you've covered politics over here. What did you think of the body language between Theresa May and Donald Trump, just briefly?
I think it felt at times that she was actually in charge. It felt like Donald Trump was trying to be more statesman-like, apart from, of course, moments like we discussed then with Mexico. I thought one of the most telling moments was when our very own Laura Kuenssberg, our political editor, asked a very tough question of President Trump. And what I've been seeing on social media since then is people saying, well, actually, British journalists are actually asking some tougher questions than we've seen in the US.
They absolutely are. Rajini Vaidyanathan, thank you so much for that. The update on that press conference. And you are watching BBC News live here in Washington, D.C.